we need to think more broadly about, and more from a first principles perspective, and have a less dogmatic perspective, a less dogmatic approach to what soil disturbance actually means and whether it's actually harmful.
Coming up, we have John Kempf back on the podcast to talk about all things regenerative ag in 2025. The Modern Acre is the podcast for builders in ag who think differently. The Modern Acre podcast is presented by Myland, a soil health company that's revolutionizing agriculture. Through their innovative soil as a service, Myland partners with farmers to improve their soil health with the power of beneficial live native microalgae. The result? Healthier soils, more productive farms, and benefits like smarter water use. Discover how Myland can transform your farm at myland.ag.
Ty, big day yesterday. How you feeling? You know I'm talking about the college football playoff, right? Thought Notre Dame might have had a chance, but it looks like Ohio State's going to take it. It's the fourth quarter right now, so the game's not over, but not looking great.
Yeah, I was like, where are you going with this, Tim? We try to avoid politics on the Modern Acre podcast, but it always comes back to football.
We do not avoid sports or football.
We do not avoid sports and football. Yeah, I haven't watched. I don't really have any rooting interest in either team. All right, Tim. I'm so pumped to get John Kempf back on the podcast. We had him on a few years ago. It's actually I just checked the receipts. It's one of our most downloaded podcasts ever, top 10. We're really excited to get him back on. He is really an expert in regenerative agriculture. And I wanted to get him back on, Tim, to just talk about what's changed. What's changed? What have you changed your mind about recently? What's happening on the ground with, he has his advancing eco agriculture consultancy, and they also make biological products. How are things going? And what are you seeing on the ground? And I think we got a ton of really interesting perspectives and opinions, and even about the new administration coming in, Tim, all of his thoughts about regenerative agriculture. We got the latest from John Kempf, which was awesome. Before we jump into this interview, Tim, we've been working on a project. We talked about it a little bit on the Acre Awards, and we are going to announce it next week.
I know. I cannot contain myself, Ty. I'm excited to announce this with the world, what we've been working on.
So be sure, hit the subscribe button. You don't want to miss this. We're going to be announcing this project that's been honestly almost a year in the making, probably 9 months in the making, in the regenerative ag space. So if you're into regenerative agriculture, specifically around biologicals, you do not want to miss next week, the announcement we have coming. And if you're interested, if you're a farmer, if you're an agronomist that's really into biologicals, we've been trialing them over the past few years on our farm. If you're really passionate about biologicals, the opportunity they present, or if you're a biological company yourself, you have a unique product, technology that you're going to market with, reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you this week, give you a sneak peek of what we're working on in advance of the announcement next week. So if you're in one of those camps, connect with us on LinkedIn, shoot us a message. That's probably the best way to get in touch. And we'd love to share what we're working on before we give the big announcement next week, Tim. I'm very excited about it.
I know, I'm super pumped. Well, with that being said, let's jump in with what's top of mind for John.
It's the time of year when we kind of revisit, we have a retrospective of what happened this last year, what are the things that we learned, and what are the things that we want to explore and work on this year. And it's conference season. I've been attending a lot of conferences and giving lots of presentations, and there is so much exciting innovation happening in the agricultural landscape generally. That's been true for years, but for the first time, I shouldn't say for the first time, because I always come back from conferences being invigorated and inspired by the innovative work that people are doing. But there's been a pattern that I've noticed this year that I haven't seen before, at least not to this degree, and that is specifically around the conversation of nutrient density and trying to produce food as a public good and trying to produce food that has immunotherapy quality. There's lots of people who've been giving lip service to the idea and saying, oh, that sounds like a great idea. And of course, we want to grow healthy food for people. But there's a growing new group of farmers who are actually measuring. They are sending samples of their food to laboratories. They're measuring the phytonutrient content. They're measuring the vitamin and the mineral content. They're comparing it with others that are in the industry and the other products that are on the shelf, and discovering some remarkable differences. And one of the conferences I was at shared beef sticks from Ripley Cove Farm in Indiana that are 100% grass-fed beef. They are processed in a special way to reduce the histamine content, and they have measured phytonutrient content that is, depending on which phytonutrient you're referring to, anywhere from 2 times to 8 times above the average of the grass-fed index of what is average for grass-fed with Stefan's laboratory in Utah. And it's just that type of work. People were saying, oh, we should do this. We'd like to do this. This sounds like a good idea. And now it's actually happening. I just use one grass-fed beef example, but there's dozens of examples that I've encountered in the last month that are all just really exciting, because then you get to taste those foods. You get to experience them. It's like, wow, I want everyone to experience this. It's the equivalent of having a garden-grown strawberry versus a strawberry off the shelf. The two don't compare.
My wife and I were just having this conversation of like, man, I wish I could taste the strawberry like how they tasted when I was a kid, right? Like it's just
you can. You just have to grow them yourself.
Exactly, exactly. But I think it's a really interesting space, John. I mean, we've heard this before, right? Like a tomato grown today compared to a tomato grown, a few generations ago. The nutritional difference, right? Of it's not as nutrient dense as it was. I think that you're spot on that some of these consumer brands that can do the research, make the claim, may warrant a premium in the market. Or where do you think this goes ultimately? Like, do you think that this is going to stay with specific consumer brands that can tell that end-to-end story and share the data? Where does this go with produce in the grocery store?
That's a good question, and I don't pretend to have an answer, because it's in large part it's a political question, it's a social movement question, and those things are never easy. The reality is only a very small segment of consumers care enough to pay more for quality today. I mean, we have organic certification still sub 10%, and in essence, what I'm talking about, the organic certification is a certification supposedly of absence of toxins. And the next component of quality is not just the absence of toxins, but the actual presence of quality, the presence of nutrition, however that might be defined for a particular food product. So kind of two thoughts. One is, I think it is a subset of consumers that actually cares. It's also just a fraction of consumers that has the ability to pay. On the other hand, when we consider food production from a national health and a food security perspective, the reality is that it is my opinion that we have a cheap food policy at the federal level. What we should be having is a healthy food policy. When we think about the fact that we have $4.3 trillion in annual healthcare costs, most of that being for degenerative diseases and illnesses like diabetes and stroke and heart disease and on the list goes, autoimmune diseases. I mean, we now have, according to the CDC data, 20% of all the people under the age of 18 have an autoimmune disease. 60% of all people have one chronic illness. 50% of all the guys and all the ladies living today can be expected to have cancer in their lifetime. Like, why would we accept that as being normal? And it's certainly not, I'm not suggesting that this is only an agricultural cause problem, but agriculture and food production has the opportunity to be a large part of the solution. There's other contributing factors to why this is the case. It's food processing, and we could have a long conversation about other contributing factors. But if you think about just cancer for a moment, all right, half of the population is expected to have cancer in their lifetime. If you go to Google Scholar and you do a search for selenium and for various types of cancer, I haven't done the actual count myself, but I've close friends with multiple people who have. to tell me that there are over 400 peer-reviewed published papers in the literature reporting that selenium has positive effects on preventing and treating all types of different cancers. Shouldn't we consider ensuring that we have adequate selenium levels in our food supply as a part of a national health policy? Isn't that something that would be relatively easy and inexpensive? I mean, compared to $4.3 trillion in healthcare costs, it would be relatively inexpensive to produce biofortified foods that have baseline levels of selenium in them to make sure that the entire population has a baseline level of selenium. It seems to me, from a national food policy perspective, that's something that we should be able to get behind and all agree on, and yet it's not part of the conversation at this point. So, to your question about how does this grow? How does this develop? If we rely on consumer education and we rely on individuals who care about quality to pay for a premium, it grows slowly and it remains niche. On the other hand, if we get large players, whether those be retailers, CPG companies, or governments, to authentically care about their customer and about climate impact and human health impact, the reality is producing healthier, higher quality isn't that much more expensive. I mean, if we continue with our selenium example, we can produce foods that are biofortified with selenium for a cost of, I don't even know exactly, but off the top of my head, I would say it's in the neighborhood of $10 to $20 an acre. It's very low, and compared to the human health impact that we could have collectively. So those are the types of things that I think from a food policy perspective, we should be thinking about, but we're not.
Yeah, this is a super interesting topic. I heard you chat with RFK Jr. on his podcast about this whole concept and kind of the intersection of agricultural food production and the conflict of interest almost with the big pharma industry and kind of what that looks like. What do you think is going to happen with kind of this incoming administration, the Make America Healthy Again movement? Like, I think it is kind of a small conversation, but it tends to be getting more mainstream in conversations that people are having. So what do you think the impact of the incoming administration will be on kind of food production?
Well, I have a dream and a vision for what it could be and for what I would desire it to be, but I'm also quite cynical given what I observe going on in Washington generally about the effectiveness of the federal government at actually getting anything accomplished. So if it's possible to be both optimistic and pessimistic at the same time, then I hold both of those in my brain at once. So I don't really have a clear perspective and insight. It's not clear to me that Kennedy at this point has any significant influence in what is happening in the USDA. He might. It's wait and see. It's wait and see. I don't have any insights into that at this point.
John, I want to, pick your brain a little bit. I'm sure you get that. I'm sure people email you or text you or call you and say, "Hey, John, I want to pick your brain." But I get to do it because I'm the host of this doggone podcast. So you're on the ground, right? You're talking to growers. You're supporting regenerative transitions, consulting, AEA. Regen has made a lot of progress over the past few years. I'm curious, like what you're seeing on the ground of just the state of adoption, especially in a climate of lower commodity prices. What's working for growers right now, and maybe what's not working that you're seeing on the ground with regenerative ag?
That's a great question, Tyler. The unfortunate part about us as humans and change is that most of us change when we have to. There's a very small percentage of us that change because we enjoy it. There are some, but it's a small group. And what that translates to is that collectively as a society, if we take a democratic approach to change, or if there are large scale changes that require the involvement of a large part of the population, our historical habit is to walk all the way up to the edge of the cliff and lean out over it and stare down, and then try to walk back. And so when we look at what is happening with the vagaries of the weather and the climatic extremes that we're experiencing, people would like to engage in a debate about climate change and whether it's caused by humans or whether it's caused by carbon dioxide, whether it's caused by solar particle flux, or on and on the list goes. I find all of that to just be a distraction, because there's one thing that we all agree on. We all agree on the solution. Whether we want to debate that the climate impacts are caused by dysfunction or dysregulation of the small water cycle, or whether it's solar particle flux, or whether it's carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, the solution for all of those is to get more carbon into the ground and to grow more healthy green plants. That's the solution to regulating all of that. Regardless of what the point source is, that's the solution. We can agree on the solutions, but collectively, we failed to address that because it requires collective action, and we haven't leaned far enough over the edge of the cliff yet, apparently. But I got sidetracked. Charles Walters had this quote, passed away now 15 years ago, but he used to say, people leave their senses as a group and they come to their senses one at a time. And when I look at the state of what is happening in the agricultural space generally, and how challenged we are as individuals with change, it's unfortunate. The macroeconomic conditions for growers generally have been becoming more and more challenging. They've been challenging for a while. They were challenging in 23. They've become even more challenging in 24. They appear to be becoming even more challenging in 2025. And it is in that environment, it's like I have a lot of empathy for the farmers who find themselves struggling. And at the same time, it is that exact environment where people become the most open to change and the most open to doing things differently. So when you think about the pioneers of the regenerative agriculture space, the Joel Salatons and Gabe Browns and the Will Harrises of the world, the people who are all the icons, who have lots of name recognition, Rick Clark, when they share their story about how they got started going down this pathway, in the upper 90% of people, the early pioneers who went down the regenerative agriculture pathway, did so as a result of one of two things. Most of them, it was a result of economic duress. They were financially backed into the corner and they had no choice. And the second group was because of significant health challenges, either their own or members of their family. And so I have a lot of sympathy for where farmers find themselves, but I actually think that the tremendous interest in adopting regenerative agriculture and using fewer inputs, being smarter about the use of biologicals, I believe the level of interest is as high as it is because of the challenging economic situation. So that's what I see happening. And there's this interesting phenomena. Biological inoculants in soils tend to, I'm just using these as a particular case in point, they tend to thrive best and deliver the best results when they're not put into a nutrient-rich environment. And so this is actually for many farmers who are considering lowering their use of fertilizers, lowering their input purchases. This is actually the golden opportunity. It's the very best scenario, the very best context in which to try biological inoculants, because that's the environment in which they are most likely to thrive.
That's a really good point. I think a lot of times when growers go into this and they're looking to incorporate a new practice or a new product, like there's a hesitation to scale back kind of their conventional program, and they add one new thing in versus kind of to really actually see the benefit. To your point, you need to cut back on the conventional and give the biologicals an environment where they can actually thrive. I guess, how do those conversations go with growers? Because like we're guilty of this as well. Like we want to try new things, but we're a little bit hesitant to risk the crop and like lose yield and kind of get that confidence. So maybe just talk us through kind of that challenge with growers, getting them to scale back on the conventional side of things.
For those of our listeners not familiar with the background, the scope, I started a company called Advancing Eco Agriculture Consulting Company, and what kind of our magic tool in the toolbox in this case has been the use of SAP analysis. So, there's this quip or joke, although I don't find it to be a joke at all because I relate with farmers and I was a farmer for a long time, is that soil analysis are just fertilizer sales tools. And that's unfortunately far too often true. And SAP analysis are a sales tool for us to convince farmers that they need less fertilizer. Where We can actually, so our approach generally has been to say, okay, if we start working with a new operation, we might think based on what we discover or learn about what's going on the farm, we might think that there's probably room for reducing nitrogen and potassium applications and maybe phosphorus applications, but we don't know. We have the historical data. We can look and kind of evaluate what's been going on and what's been happening. But when you pull a SAP analysis report, you can see in real time, does this crop actually have enough nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus? Do you need to add more? And so our approach generally has been, let's be cautious. Let's err on the side of caution. Let's not recommend that we back away too quickly. But if the opportunity exists, if a farm is set up with irrigation and has the capacity to inject nutrients or to apply nutrients in some way, then let's start small, start with small application rates, and work our way up as necessary, indicated by the data. Then you don't have, it's not a guessing game. You can have confidence and reassurance that the data is telling you exactly where you are, where you need to go. And that is very reassuring to growers. It inspires confidence, and it's real. You don't have to guess. And so I think that's been the foundation of what has allowed us to be as impactful as we've been, is we can make decisions in the season, during the season, based on what is happening in the field. And as a result, we don't rely on biology to deliver XY amounts of nutrients to the point where we shoot our foot off, because we find we're not in a position where we have to depend on them. We can supplement as needed based on how the crop and the soil is performing.
John, something that I've struggled with a little bit is because there's so many solutions or products on the market for increasing soil health. You mentioned before, sometimes like the best results we'll get are in a depleted soil, right? So sometimes I look at what's out there on the market and it almost feels like everything works and nothing works.
Yep.
Because there's so much out. There's different products and services. Like there's people that are putting kelp products, seaweed products on the soil, and sometimes it has a good response. There's others that are doing like, Tim, you saw a farmer recently that was doing like fish.
Like fish poop biological burial.
Yeah, like
that sounds like something you'd sell to cannabis growers.
Yeah, but there's all these different solutions. There's microalgae, right? There's all these different things. Like, what's your thoughts on that? Does like everything work? Does nothing work? Does maybe everything work to a certain extent? And I don't literally mean everything, but yeah, I think you see my point.
Yeah, I do. It's you're asking me to describe a forest by describing all the trees, and that could be a very lengthy process, Tyler.
I'm wondering is like, maybe if I can process it myself. Like it almost feels when the soil is really depleted, a lot of things will have a positive effect on increasing soil health. But perhaps once you're further down your soil health journey, maybe that's requires inherently a more thoughtful, detailed, analytical approach.
Yeah. So I want to clarify. You've now twice used the phrase of soils that are nutrient depleted, and when I was describing the opportunity that growers have if they're considering using less fertilizer, I described it in terms of not being a nutrient-rich environment, and so those aren't quite the same thing. And I want to describe what I intended to communicate there. So. What I'm referring to specifically is that there's two types of nutrient-rich environments that biology and biological populations tend to find somewhat challenging. The first is when you simply have a very high electrical conductivity, when you have a high salt index. Like there's when you have high EC, and this can really happen easily when fertilizers are applied banded or they're in a concentrated form in a furrow, or particularly in the proximity of the root system. That high EC environment is not one that biology tends to really thrive in. So that's one aspect. And the other aspect is that, let's say you have microbes that are particularly good at phosphorus solubilization or at nitrogen fixation. they don't need to spend any energy in solubilizing phosphorus or fixing nitrogen if the soil already has abundant levels of phosphorus and nitrogen. So if you add microbial inoculant of azospirillum and azotobacter and various nitrogen fixing bacteria, and then you add even a small, well, it's not true to say even a small dose, but if you add nitrogen fertilizer beyond a certain threshold, then that biology has no need to fix nitrogen. So they don't. So you can actually shut down the effects and the benefits of some types of microbes based on the fertilizers that you apply. So that was what I was intending to communicate there. But when you think about, I'm thinking about your question of microbial inoculants, and just, I think this is true of biostimulants in general. There are hundreds of products available in the marketplace now, probably thousands. And many of them, I believe most of them, are very effective some of the time. And the question that I've started asking to evaluate different ingredients and different products to see whether we want to explore working with them, I think that the question to ask is not what yield response or what plant response did you get, but rather what percentage of the time do you get a positive response? So if you get a positive response, I mean, we're talking about biological products, none of them are ever going to get a positive response 100% of the time. But what is the threshold for effectiveness? Is it, do they need to give a positive response 40% of the time, 60%, 80%? Where's the threshold? And the threshold depends a little bit on how remarkable is the response when they are positive. So I had this really great experience, get to meet all these amazing people. But the first week of December, I spoke at a conference in Minnesota, and this gentleman walks up to me at lunch, and he says, you don't know me and you don't know what I've been up to, but here's who I am. I'm a farmer and I'm a professional agronomist. And for the last 2 years, you didn't know it, but I was running field scale experiments on BioCoat Gold on corn and soybeans across my entire farming operation. So he had 16 fields with 2 years of data and across multiple varieties. And he's, I should have it right here in front of me when I'm talking about it, but I think on the soybeans, we got something like a 4.5, 4.5 or 5x ROI 60% of the time. And on the corn, we got a 3.7 or 4x ROI 76% of the time. So that's the type of evaluation that we should apply to our biological inoculants and to thinking about microbial biostimulants. That's what we should ask of input providers and companies as well. Because the reality is soil conditions, soil microbiomes, crops are so wildly variable. It's unreasonable to ask a biological inoculant or most biological inoculants to deliver exceptional results 100% of the time. But they should be able to do that, in my opinion, upwards of 60% of the time. And it needs to be significant, not incremental, but it needs to be pretty significant for that. And so there's a couple of products out there, ingredients and stuff that I've looked at that are frankly remarkable. They will show 30x, 40x ROI. They produce remarkable results, but they produce those results only 15 to 20% of the time. And my concern is that there is too high a proportion of the microbial inoculants and biostimulants that are in the marketplace fit into that category. They produce remarkable results, but only a small percentage of the time. And the difficulty is parsing out in which are those situations and what are the common factors required for success in which these particular products are exceptionally successful. That's the piece we need to become better at figuring out. And that's the piece that I think the manufacturers need to become better at figuring out, is what are the scenarios that allows their particular product to deliver exceptional performance.
Super interesting framework to think about it. Like, I think that's super important, of having like multi-years of data, multiple fields. I think it's sometimes farmers will try something at a very small scale of like, I'll just do, 1 acre of a 50 acre field and do it one season. And like, make a decision off of that just one variable, like that anything could have happened that year, and like looking at it from a longer term perspective. And I think that's interesting of like, this product works really good, but it might be 60% efficacious, and like it's going to help growers, I think, analyze these products a little bit better versus just like, I think right now it's that whole piece isn't being part of the conversation. It's just this product works and not the context that you're talking about.
And in defense of the people who are developing the product, developing the type of data that I just got done talking about is expensive and it takes time. And it's particularly for newer products that are just getting out of the marketplace. I know of some products, some biostimulants and biologicals that have been developed that delivered just remarkable results that were acquired by large agrochemical corporations who shall remain unnamed and put on the shelf. And they were not put on the shelf. I mean, people might look at that and assume nefarious intentions, because the reality is some of these microbial inoculants are more effective than fungicides in some of the trials and some of the stuff that I've seen, which is pretty remarkable. But I'm not of the persuasion that there's necessarily nefarious intent. But what they're looking at, the framework that they're looking at as a large multinational corporation is to say, all right, in order for us to develop this product and bring it to the marketplace, I have heard recently from a couple of different directions that the cost to develop a biological inoculant, to develop the labeling and the research to get it labeled as a biocontrol and to bring it to market on scale is somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million. Well, if you have to have that type of make that type of investment, the only way you can justify that type of investment is if you have a product that is broad scale applicability. And for many of these biological inoculants and biostimulants, you might have a microbial inoculant that is incredibly effective. It's more effective than the fungicides at, I'm making something up here, at treating powdery mildew. But that's the only thing it works on. It's only effective on powdery mildew. And all of a sudden, you don't have a big enough addressable market to justify a $300 million investment. And I think that's the challenging scenario. Farmers and agronomists are saying, hey, we're really intrigued by these biological inoculants and these biostimulants, but we need more data. We need better data. And on the side of the biological inoculant manufacturers, they're saying, yeah, we want to develop more data. We want to work with growers and with agronomists to develop more data and put it out there. But we don't have the resources to develop the data to the level that you are looking for without going to the market first. Like it's a catch-22 situation.
John, as we kind of wrap up here, has there been anything related to regenerative agriculture that you've changed your mind on in the past?
That's my question, Tyler.
And now my question. The tables have turned.
My goodness, I've changed my mind about so many things. Which do I pick on? What have I changed my mind about recently? One of the things that I keep thinking about and I keep shifting my point of view on is how we use nitrogen and the impact of nitrogen on the soil microbiome. So a bit ago, I was talking about how large applications of nitrogen fertilizer, or even not so large, even mid-range applications of nitrogen fertilizer can suppress the soil microbiome. However, small applications of nitrogen fertilizer in conjunction with carbon can enhance the development of the microbiome. That can speed up bacterial populations. And, I used to have this perspective for a long time. I think it might have been, at least in part, inspired by Gary Zimmer when I interviewed him on the podcast years ago. I asked him the question, if he could wave a magic wand and that would produce significant change, what action would he take? What would he do? And his answer was he would make nitrogen very expensive. I can't remember. Either was he would make nitrogen very expensive or he would make it illegal. But the point was, if you make nitrogen very expensive to buy, then you are inspired to figure out how you can grow it by using legume cover crops and using microbial inoculants and so forth. And so when you study the impact of nitrogen, the negative health impacts that it has on plants, you quickly come to, or at least I came to have not a disdain, but I really wanted to make sure that we avoid having excessive levels of nitrogen in crops and in soils. And I suppose that's still true in concept today, but I've also encountered a number of situations where we scaled back on nitrogen too hard, too quickly, too earlier. And that was, in most cases, a result of grower desire, farmer desire. They wanted to figure out how to transition to organics, and they went too fast, too quickly. And I've come to appreciate that nitrogen management is kind of foundational. When we think about driving photosynthesis, one of the foundational aspects of having plants that have the ability to photosynthesize a lot is just simply having a lot of vegetation, having a large leaf area. And the reality is nitrogen is one of the things that drives that. So it's one of the things that can so easily be driven to excess, and so often is, but is still necessary to manage, and to manage wisely and carefully in soils and plants. So that's one thing that my perspective continues to shift on. And another one that I suppose my own perspective, it's continued to shift and evolve over the years, but I've been really rather frustrated at times with the dogmatic discussion around tillage, where we have this, what should be a spectrum, but we have people at these opposite polarities, the opposite ends of the spectrum, where one group says soils should never ever be tilled, and the other group says that tillage is not harmful at all. And I've been thinking about that. It's one of I really prefer to identify what are the foundational principles, what are first principles thinking. And in the five rules of soil health, or 5 concepts of soil health, there is one of the foundational pieces is minimize soil disturbance. And I actually just got done writing an article. It hasn't been published yet, but it'll be interesting to see how people respond to it. Or I take that and I argue that our goal as stewards, to be good stewards of the landscape, to be good stewards of the soil, should not be to minimize disturbance, but to optimize disturbance for the greatest health and productivity outcomes. Because so many of the things that we do are a disturbance. I mean, if you graze livestock at a high population density, that's significant disturbance. And soil disturbance has been defined in terms of physical disturbance. Tillage, you physically move the soil particles. But in fact, there are two other types of disturbance as well. There's also chemical disturbance, like what happens when you introduce fungicides into the soil and you alter the biological profile. And or maybe a better way of saying chemical disturbance would be to just say you alter the chemistry environment of the soil in such a way that it alters biology and alters structure. So you add a little bit of urea and you enhance the microbial population, or you add a little bit of calcium. And then you have you also have the biological component, like what happens when you have biological disturbance. So I suppose there's chemistry disturbance, there's biological disturbance, perhaps by adding a fungicide or on one end of the spectrum, or a microbial inoculant on the other end of the spectrum. And my reason for thinking about this was triggered by a friend, a colleague, a farmer from North Dakota who prefers to remain unnamed, but he pointed out that he has 40 years of experience in no-till. And then he was asked to run a neighboring farm, a neighboring property that is not his own, organically with row crops. And so for weed control, he had no choice except to till. But what he observed on those soils and those fields is that he removed the fertilizer applications, he removed the biological disturbance and the chemistry disturbance. And so on those soils, they still had the physical disturbance. But the health of those soils, the biological succession, moved faster than it did on soils that were no-till, but still had fertilizers and pesticides applied to them. And so I think we need to think more broadly about, and more from a first principles perspective, and have a less dogmatic perspective, a less dogmatic approach to what soil disturbance actually means and whether it's actually harmful.
Yeah, that's super interesting. A lot of nuance there. Like when we have folks out to the farm and tell them what we're working on, and they bring up, are you no-till? And like in our situation, being an annual vegetable farmer, it's near impossible when we have some crops are in 40-inch beds and 60s, where like every year we're kind of manipulating the soil to have different furrow configurations based on the crop, and things like drip irrigation, where we're having to put drip tape underneath the soil, like disturbing it. And like the trade-off is we're saving water, we're being more efficient with our irrigations, versus like if we didn't do that, we would have to furrow flood irrigate and wastewater. So it's a complex conversation, not as black and white as till or no till.
No. Few conversations in agriculture and farming are black and white. There's always a spectrum. There's always nuance.
Totally. Well, John, this has been a ton of fun having you back on the podcast. As we wrap up, how can our listeners get in touch and connect with you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Lots of places. My personal website is johnkempf.com. Our company is Advancing Eco Agriculture, advancingecoag.com. And you can always listen to my podcast, the Regenerative Agriculture Podcast. And I'm on a lot of the social media platforms. And I enjoy connecting with people. So one of the most rewarding things for me is to actually get to interact with growers and to solve problems. It's so much fun to when a grower calls and says, "Hey, I'm having problems with this disease or this insect pest, or have this fruit quality challenge," and we can solve that in the course of a couple of short conversations. And so, yeah, please do reach out to us, and we would love to help you.
So, Ty, what do you think of the conversation with John?
John delivered. He came in, high expectations, he delivered. I think what was really interesting in his talk about nitrogen and kind of the interplay with nitrogen application and biological efficacy, mind blown there. And it sounds like he's learning a lot himself. And I think that was really cool. Is he's a learner. He's always iterating on his understanding of best practices in regenerative agriculture. And I think we just need more of that in ag in general, and just in general, like constant learning. You don't have to have these strong opinions that you have blinders on for, right? And John is learning on the ground, and that was really cool to see. So yeah, what he was talking about with nitrogen was kind of blowing my mind.
Yeah, when we asked him that question, what have you changed your mind about recently? Is like, I change my mind like multiple times a week and keep like a notepad. Just like I love that mentality of just constantly learning and improving on what you think you know. So I think that was a great perspective.
All right. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that one. Again, subscribe. Make sure you don't miss our announcement next week. If you're really interested in ag biologicals, reach out to us in advance. We'd love to tell you what we're working on, see if you want to participate. But we will talk to you guys next week with the big announcement.